Hi folks, welcome to Broken Claw Mountain Works, coming to you from the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. Today we're going to work on a bear skull, doing a European mount for that skull. So I was fortunate enough to harvest a bear last week, and we were able to dress and quarter and skin that bear and get the parts over to Crippen's Processing in Lake George, Colorado. Many thanks to them for the fantastic processing work that they do, and then got that pelt over to Timberline Taxidermy in Colorado Springs. Also fantastic work from those folks. Many thanks to both those great organizations. But what I have left is the skull, and so this is an application that most folks with a little bit of practice can master at home. Let's take a look at a few of the things that we'll need to make this happen. The first thing is a good workstation. I particularly like to use the bucket of my tractor. I can adjust it to an appropriate height for me. It cleans up easily, and you know, my wife is happy that there's not a lot of game smell in the house. I use an apron and some rubber gloves. There's always a trichinosis concern when handling bear meat, and then a good set of knives. I use at home a far more in-depth set of knives than I would in the field. It's nice to have that array of tools at home. And then in this case, we have a bear skull with all the flesh still on it, to include eyeballs. And so we're gonna have to work on removing a lot of that prior to the boiling process. Next, we'll also use a nice big industrial trash can for any parts that we don't want and we don't necessarily want to scatter. And then I use a 40% peroxide solution that you can get at any beauty supply store. The good folks at Sally Beauty here in town take care of us real well. That product only costs a couple dollars. In addition, we use a big propane boiler to boil that skull. And then finally, a power washer. The power washer doesn't need to take paint off of anything. It just needs to work on that skull. All right, folks, we're gonna get to work on this skull. So it's mostly thawed out. What we want to do is we want to remove as much of this flesh as we possibly can before we start the boiling process, right? And so I like this knife for the eyes, especially because that tip is rounded and it's got a blade all the way around the front part of that knife, and so that makes going around an eye socket a fairly easy process, right? There we go. Same thing here. There we go. Now we're just going to start removing as much flesh as we possibly can. All right, folks, once we've removed a good portion of that soft tissue from the skull, it's time for the boil process. You don't have to get too carried away on removing soft tissue. The boiling process is really going to loosen the majority of that up, or whatever is remaining rather, and we'll be able to take most of it off with the power washer. And so Once we're at this point, we take our skull and we submerge it in the boil. You only need enough water boiling to completely submerge the skull, and I like to also use about a half a scoop of OxyClean, and that'll help loosen up all the oils and the fats, that fatty tissue, and help loosen up all that soft tissue once you hit it with the power washer. Another problem you might have is if you overdo it with the OxyClean, your pot will have a tendency to boil over. So let's see what happens if we. And there it goes. It's starting to rise. It'll boil right over and knock your fire out. So what I like to do to kind of keep that at bay is I just set a fan up next to the pot blowing across the top, and it'll continue to boil, but that fan will keep it from boiling over. All right, so after about 30 minutes of boiling in that OxyClean water, it's time to take this skull out and hit it with the power washer. So let's see if we can snag a portion of it so we don't get, there we go. So if you've never used a power washer before, especially on an animal or animal parts, animal skull, it's best to have a rain suit and some rubber boots, or in my case, a garbage bag, because there's a good chance that parts will fly. And we'll just keep power washing like this until we get as much off as will possibly come off. And at that point, we can make an assessment if we can get the rest off with a knife, or maybe some needle nose pliers, or if we need to reboil it. So after the initial boil and about 10 minutes worth of power washing, this is where we're at. You'll notice that we got a good portion of that soft tissue off. And you also notice that the lower jaw came off as we power washed away what remaining muscle and tendons were still there. This particular bear had a shattered lower jaw, which I think will, if I find all the jaw parts, we'll be able to remedy with some super glue and get that back together. You'll notice that we got all that the upper part of his mouth out. You'll also notice in here that we still have a little bit left in the nose canal that we can get with some needle nose pliers. You also notice right here and right here, there's two holes that go into that brain cavity. Covering those holes were two pieces of bone that look like that. As we power washed and we exposed that piece, you can just get in there with a knife and just kind of pluck that piece out. And what that does then is allow access to that brain in three locations, here, and in the back, which makes power washing that brain much easier. All right, so at this point, we're ready to start the bleaching process. So you'll notice that nasal cavity is all gone, nothing in there. You'll also notice that that brain cavity is also empty. We got as much of that soft tissue out as we possibly could in there. Any of that soft tissue that's left in there, is going to cause a potential for odor, and so you want to remove as much of that as possible. And so now we're going to take all these parts that we have, the upper part of the skull, the lower part, and those jaw pieces that we're going to try and fix, and we're going to put it in another boiling solution. So again, enough water just to cover the skull, and then we just mix that bottle of peroxide we showed earlier, and we're going to stick this in here and let it boil for about 10 or 15 minutes. So we've been boiling in that water and peroxide solution for about 10 or 15 minutes now, and let's see how we did. Looking pretty good. Looking pretty good. So that skull is nice and white now, and it will continue to whiten as time goes. All right, look at that, huh? Looks pretty good. So we'll take those other parts from the lower jaw and we'll reassemble them with some crazy glue or super glue, and we'll see if we can't get this whole thing back together. Okay, so we let this skull dry overnight, and I think we're ready to try and reassemble this this shattered lower jawbone. So we can do this pretty easily with just some super glue. Make sure everything lines up nice, and we'll get this on right away. Now this will cure real quick, and hopefully dry clear. We're just going to hold it together while it's drying, and then we're going to work on making it really strong with a combination of super glue and baking soda. So this will dry in about 30 seconds. Then we'll work on the next part of this, which is okay. So we reattached all those parts that had broken off with some super glue. And then once we had a bead of super glue on the crack right there, we just sprinkled some baking soda on it, just like that, right? And it creates a bone-like seal. And what we can do is, once that cures after about 30 minutes completely, we can sand that down. So you'll notice that all those pieces that were broken off before now are rock solid on there, right? Just with that super glue and that baking soda. The key on that baking soda is that while you're doing that, make sure you're wearing gloves so you don't end up with a chemical burn. So if we reassemble this guy, looks pretty good.